If that gate fails, 32 worlds lose their homes. If you stay, you lose your life. The warning echoed across the command deck, and for a heartbeat, no one answered. Rows of alien officers stared at the collapsing quantum gateway hanging outside the observation window like a dying star, its blue-white surface rippling harder every second as emergency alarms pulsed through the station. Every tactical display painted the same conclusion in bright crimson letters. Probability of successful stabilization, 0.03%. Commander Kaelor Voss folded his hands behind his back without the slightest trace of emotion. Initiate full evacuation, he ordered. Seal engineering. Leave the maintenance crews behind if necessary. No one questioned him. In the Galactic Alliance, numbers were absolute. If the odds said a mission had failed, continuing was considered irrational. Escape pods began launching from the station in organized waves, tiny flashes of light disappearing into the darkness beyond the viewport. Nathan Brooks stood alone near an auxiliary engineering console, grease staining the sleeve of his Navy work shirt as he quietly read the same report everyone else had already accepted. 38 years old, a civilian contractor from Columbus, Ohio, he had spent the last 11 months replacing valves, repairing coolant pumps, and crawling through maintenance shafts that nobody else wanted to touch. He was not military. He carried no weapon. His employee badge still identified him as a Level 3 systems engineer. Kaelor walked toward him with measured steps. "Mr. Brooks," he said evenly, "the station is lost." Nathan looked up from the screen, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and asked the only question that mattered. Did every engineer vote on that? A few nearby officers exchanged confused glances. Kaelor narrowed his eyes. "The calculations have already been completed." Nathan shrugged. "Calculations don't tighten bolts." A faint ripple of uncomfortable silence spread across the room. Lieutenant Meera Solon, the youngest operations officer on the bridge, glanced from Nathan to the commander. She had reviewed the numbers herself. They were overwhelming. Every simulation ended the same way. Structural collapse. Chain reaction. Total failure. She almost felt sorry for the humans standing there pretending effort could beat mathematics. Kaelor's voice remained calm, almost patient. "You misunderstand. This is no longer a technical problem. It is a statistical certainty." Nathan reached for an old metal toolbox resting beside the console, its corners worn smooth from years of use. "Funny thing," he replied. "I've fixed a lot of equipment people called impossible. Not this. Maybe." Nathan clipped a flashlight onto his belt and started walking toward the engineering corridor. "Maybe not. But I'm not walking away before I know. That is stubbornness." Nathan smiled without looking back. "Back home we usually call it finishing the job." The bridge door slid open, swallowing him into a corridor filled with flashing emergency lights and distant warning sirens. Behind him, one evacuation countdown after another continued ticking toward zero. Kaelor watched the human disappear before quietly turning back toward the viewport. "Record his refusal," he said. "History should remember that emotion defeated reason." Meera hesitated before entering the command into the official log. For reasons she could not explain, she found herself watching the empty hallway a few seconds longer than necessary. Somewhere beyond those steel walls, one ordinary human engineer was walking toward a machine that every computer in the galaxy insisted could never be repaired. No applause followed him. No speech. No promise of victory. Only the steady sound of work boots echoing deeper into a station everyone else had already abandoned. Nathan stepped into the engineering corridor as another warning siren rolled through the station, louder than before, followed by a low vibration beneath the deck plates that made dust drift from the ceiling. The emergency lights painted everything in slow pulses of red, but he kept moving at the same steady pace, carrying the old toolbox that suddenly felt heavier than it had an hour earlier. He reached the first security checkpoint only to find two maintenance drones sitting motionless beside the door, their operating lights dark. The central network had already started shutting down non-essential systems. He sighed. "Of course you picked today to quit." He pulled a manual override key from his pocket, unlocked the access panel, and forced the door open by hand. The thick metal slid just enough for him to squeeze through before grinding to a stop. Behind him, another evacuation transport detached from the station. He did not turn around. Several months earlier, when Nathan first accepted the contract, He had imagined something very different. Better pay, interesting work, and enough money to finally stop worrying about the mortgage back home. His daughter Emma had laughed when he showed her pictures of the Alliance station before leaving Earth. "Promise you will fix something cool," she had said. He smiled at the memory, even now. I guess this counts. Back then, the alien engineers had never understood him. They had questioned why he insisted on inspecting equipment himself instead of trusting diagnostic programs. They laughed when he carried handwritten notes in an old notebook instead of storing everything inside a neural assistant. One supervisor even asked whether humans simply enjoyed making life harder for themselves. Nathan had answered with the same easy smile he always wore. Sometimes machines miss things. Nobody believed him. Nobody except one junior technician named Meera, who had quietly watched him discover a cracked coolant line that every scanner had overlooked because the damage was hidden beneath an older repair patch. She never forgot the lesson, even if everyone else did. Another violent tremor shook the corridor, interrupting the memory. Ceiling panels rattled overhead as the station groaned under increasing stress. Nathan reached Junction 7 and opened another service hatch. A blast of hot air rushed into his face. The gateway stabilization network was failing faster now. One conduit had already warped nearly 3 inches out of alignment. He crouched beside it, running his fingers across the damaged housing instead of looking at the sensor display. "You are talking," he whispered to the machine. "I just need to listen." Up on the bridge, Commander Kaelor watched the structural reports worsen by the minute. "Has the human requested assistance?" he asked. "No, Commander," an officer replied. "Has he requested additional equipment?" "No, Commander." Kaelor frowned. Then he has finally accepted reality. At that exact moment, deep inside the engineering deck, Nathan noticed something every automated system had ignored. A faint rhythmic vibration echoed through the pipe beneath his hand, repeating every 11 seconds. It was subtle, almost impossible to hear over the alarms, but it did not belong there. He slowly looked toward a sealed maintenance tunnel that had been listed as permanently inactive for nearly 12 years. "Well," he muttered, picking up his toolbox again, "that is interesting." Without another word, he headed straight for the forgotten tunnel, while somewhere far above him another warning flashed across every command screen. Gateway stability had dropped below 1%, and for the first time since the crisis began, even the Alliance computers could no longer predict what would happen next. The forgotten maintenance tunnel was barely wide enough for Nathan to squeeze through with his toolbox in one hand and his flashlight in the other. Layers of dust covered the floor, untouched for years, but the faint vibration beneath his boots grew stronger with every step. It was steady, almost like a heartbeat hidden inside the station itself. He stopped beside an old junction box, brushed away the dust with his sleeve, and frowned. "You are not supposed to be alive." The label on the housing carried the logo of one of the first human engineering teams invited into the Alliance nearly 20 years earlier. Most of the newer alien officers probably did not even know this section existed. Nathan opened the panel with a screwdriver and found a thick mechanical bypass line running behind layers of newer quantum circuitry. Someone had never removed it. They had simply built over it. He laughed quietly to himself. That is exactly something we would do. On the bridge, Commander Kaelor watched another simulation collapse into failure. Every new calculation ended sooner than the last. "Engineering activity?" he asked. "The human has entered a decommissioned service sector," an officer answered. "There are no active systems there." Kaelor barely looked up. "Then he is wasting the little time he has left." Lieutenant Meera hesitated before speaking. "Commander, that sector was originally constructed with assistance from Earth contractors." Kaelor glanced toward her. "Primitive infrastructure. It has been obsolete for years." "Yes, Commander." She lowered her eyes, but something about Nathan's confidence continued bothering her. Down inside the forgotten tunnel, Nathan traced the old bypass line until it disappeared behind another sealed bulkhead. The electronic lock was dead, so he reached for a manual release wheel instead. It resisted at first before finally turning with a long metallic groan. Warm air rushed past him as the heavy door slowly opened. Behind it stretched a narrow service chamber surrounding one of the station's original stabilization conduits. The modern systems had been installed around it, but nobody had disconnected the backup network. Nathan walked closer, running his hand along the thick pipe. Fresh heat. Fresh vibration. You have been carrying the load this whole time, he whispered. He pulled out his notebook, flipping through pages filled with handwritten sketches collected during months of routine maintenance. Small observations, tiny noises, temperatures, valve positions, details everyone else had dismissed because the computers already tracked everything that supposedly mattered. Except they had not. Nathan suddenly realized the old bypass was compensating for microscopic alignment errors that the quantum network could no longer correct. The artificial intelligence treated the fluctuations as statistical noise and ignored them. A human mechanic heard something that sounded wrong. His radio crackled for the first time in nearly an hour. Nathan Brooks. It was Meera. Can you hear me? Barely. Commander Voss wants your position. Nathan smiled as he tightened one loose inspection bolt with a wrench. Tell him I found the problem. Silence followed. Then Meera answered carefully. The commander says that is impossible. Nathan looked at the old conduit one more time before standing up. That is because he is asking the wrong question. What question should he ask? Nathan picked up his toolbox and headed deeper into the chamber, where another maintenance ladder disappeared beneath the station. He should ask why the oldest system on this station is the only one still trying to save it. Meera stared at her communication panel without saying a word. For the first time since the emergency began, doubt spread across the bridge, not because the numbers had changed, but because one ordinary human sounded far more certain than the most advanced computers in the galaxy. Nathan climbed down the narrow maintenance ladder until his boots landed on a graded platform circling the station's oldest stabilization core. The chamber looked nothing like the polished engineering decks above. Thick mechanical pipes wrapped around the massive conduit like the roots of an ancient tree, their surfaces scratched by decades of repairs. Steam drifted through the air in slow waves, and every few seconds the entire room shuddered as the damaged gateway pushed another surge through the system. Nathan walked to the main control housing and wiped away years of dust until a faded warning label appeared beneath his hand. Manual synchronization required 2 operators. He let out a quiet breath. That is going to be a problem. He reached for his radio. Meera, I need another set of hands. Her answer came almost immediately. I am on the bridge. Not for long if you want this place to stay together. Before she could answer, another violent tremor rolled through the station. Several overhead support brackets snapped free and crashed onto the metal floor, blocking the passage Nathan had just crossed. He jumped back as a cloud of dust filled the chamber, then grabbed his flashlight and quickly checked the conduit. The old system had survived, but one of the pressure regulators had shifted nearly 2 inches. Easy, he muttered, tightening the mounting bolts with a wrench. Stay with me. On the bridge, alarms multiplied across every display. An officer looked up in disbelief. Commander, structural failures are spreading into sectors that were previously stable. Kaelor frowned. Impossible. Those sections are isolated. Another officer answered before the first could continue. They were isolated. Now they are carrying additional load from the primary network. Meera looked toward the tactical display and suddenly understood what Nathan had found. The forgotten mechanical system was keeping the station alive by absorbing stress the newer quantum network could no longer handle. It was never designed for that amount of work, but somehow it had continued operating in silence for years. Commander, she said carefully, if the backup network fails now, the gateway will lose every remaining stabilizer. Kaelor remained calm. Then the outcome does not change. Meera looked directly at him. Unless the human is right. The bridge fell silent. No one challenged the commander that openly. Kaelor finally spoke. Lieutenant, you are relieved of your tactical station. Return to your duties. Instead of moving, Meera pressed the communication panel. Nathan, I am coming. Kaelor's voice hardened. That is a direct order. She met his eyes without raising her own voice. Respectfully, Commander, if he is wrong, we lose 1 engineer. If he is right, we lose 32 worlds by standing here. Without waiting for permission, she turned and ran from the bridge toward the emergency lift. Deep below, Nathan never heard the exchange. He was already wrestling with a massive manual control wheel that had not been turned in decades. It refused to move. He planted both feet against the deck and pulled again. Metal groaned. The wheel shifted barely an inch before another shockwave slammed through the chamber, throwing tools across the platform and plunging half the room into darkness as emergency lights flickered out one by one. Nathan steadied himself against the railing, breathing hard. The old conduit released a sharp metallic howl that echoed through the chamber like a warning. He looked up just as the pressure gauge surged into the red for the first time, and he realized he no longer had hours left to solve the problem. He might only have minutes. Nathan wrapped both hands around the frozen control wheel again and leaned into it with everything he had. For a long second, nothing happened except the sound of strained metal echoing through the chamber. Then the wheel lurched forward another few inches, followed by a deep rumble that rolled through the entire station. Every pressure gauge around the old conduit dropped slightly before climbing again. "You are still fighting," Nathan whispered. "Good." His radio crackled. "Nathan, this is Meera. I made it to engineering deck 9, but half the corridors are sealed. Take the maintenance shafts. Forget the maps. Follow the vibration." There was a brief pause. "That is your navigation plan? It has worked so far." Meera could not help smiling as she started climbing over a collapsed support frame. She had spent her entire career trusting navigation systems, predictive software, and tactical overlays. Following a vibration through an abandoned mechanical tunnel sounded ridiculous, yet somehow she trusted the human more than the computers at that moment. On the bridge, Commander Kaelor stood silently as fresh reports continued arriving. Every simulation had become unstable. The artificial intelligence could no longer produce matching predictions. "Explain," he demanded. One analyst swallowed nervously. "Commander, the system is behaving outside expected models. Machines do not behave." "No, Commander. People do." Kaelor looked toward the engineering feed, where the signal kept cutting in and out. For the first time in years, certainty slipped through his fingers. Deep below, Nathan opened another inspection panel and finally saw the real problem. The old mechanical bypass was not simply supporting the quantum stabilizers. It had become the hidden foundation beneath the entire network. Every software upgrade over the past 2 decades had quietly shifted more stress onto equipment that nobody monitored anymore, because every engineer assumed newer technology had replaced it. It never had. The oldest hardware had been carrying everyone else's mistakes in complete silence. Nathan slowly nodded to himself. So that is it. He grabbed his notebook and flipped to a page filled with measurements he had recorded months earlier during what everyone had called a routine inspection. Tiny pressure differences, slight temperature increases, strange vibrations every 11 seconds. At the time, they looked unrelated. Together, they painted a completely different picture. His eyes widened. "They never had a gateway problem," he said softly. "They had a maintenance problem." The radio came alive again. "Nathan, I see the chamber," Meera called as she emerged from the opposite passage, breathing hard. She stopped when she saw the enormous mechanical assembly surrounding the conduit. "I did not know any of this existed." Nathan handed her the notebook. Neither did most of the station. She scanned the handwritten notes. "You figured all of this out without the central database?" "No," he smiled. "I figured it out because I stopped looking at the database." Before Meera could answer, every light in the chamber suddenly went dark. The emergency sirens fell silent. For one unsettling second, the station became almost completely quiet. Then the backup generator finally came online, bathing the room in dim amber lights instead of bright white. Nathan looked toward the dead control screens. "That is not good." Meera checked her communicator. "The central artificial intelligence is offline." Nathan slowly closed his toolbox. "Then from this point on, nobody is coming to tell us what to do." At that exact moment, a low mechanical thud echoed from somewhere beneath the platform, followed by another, then another, each one louder than the last, as if an ancient machine buried deep inside the station had just awakened after years of waiting, and both Nathan and Meera realized the real test had not started until now. The steady thuds beneath the platform grew louder until the entire chamber trembled with each pulse, as if the station itself had decided it was finished waiting for someone to notice it. Nathan grabbed a portable inspection lamp and climbed onto the lower catwalk while Meera followed close behind, holding the notebook against her chest. The amber emergency lights barely reached the machinery below, but the old mechanical drive was slowly coming to life, turning massive gears that had not moved in years. "What is happening?" Meera asked. Nathan knelt beside a rusted inspection hatch and listened for several seconds before answering. "The backup governor is trying to protect the conduit." "That sounds like good news." He looked at her with a tired smile. "Only if it finishes before the gateway tears itself apart." On the bridge, the return of partial emergency power restored a handful of command systems. Commander Kaelor immediately stepped toward the operations console. Status. An officer answered without looking away from the display. The central artificial intelligence remains offline. Manual control only. Kaelor did not hesitate. Disconnect the obsolete backup network. It is interfering with the quantum stabilizers. Meera's communicator suddenly came alive with the command. Nathan froze for half a second before closing his eyes. No, he thinks the old system is causing the instability, Meera said quietly. He is wrong. Nathan reached for the communicator. Commander, listen carefully. If you disconnect that network, every modern stabilizer loses its foundation. Kaelor's voice remained calm and controlled. Mr. Brooks, every available model identifies that mechanical system as obsolete. Because every model assumes somebody removed it years ago. Our records show exactly that. Nathan looked around the chamber. Then your records have been lying to you for 20 years. Silence filled the channel. Kaelor finally spoke again. Proceed with the shutdown. Somewhere above them, heavy isolation doors began sliding into place with a deep metallic boom. Nathan looked toward the ceiling as indicator lights changed from amber to red. He just sealed us in. Meera checked another panel and felt her stomach drop. He also cut power to this section. The work lights flickered before fading until only Nathan's portable lamp remained. The old governor continued turning, but much more slowly now. Nathan immediately dropped to one knee and opened another service panel. Help me remove this cover. What are you doing? Buying time. Together they lifted the heavy metal plate away, revealing a maze of gears, flywheels, and pressure rods moving in perfect rhythm. Everything depended on momentum. Without electrical assistance, the mechanism would gradually slow until the gateway failed. Nathan reached into his toolbox and pulled out a thick steel wrench. Meera stared at him. You cannot be serious. He wedged the wrench into a locking socket and gripped it with both hands. If the motor cannot keep spinning, he took a deep breath. Then we do it ourselves. The resistance was overwhelming. Every inch demanded more effort than the last, but the massive flywheel began moving again, little by little. Above them, new readings appeared on the bridge. An astonished officer looked at Kaelor. Commander, the mechanical governor is accelerating without external power. Kaelor stared at the impossible data. That cannot happen. The officer swallowed. It is happening. Deep below, Nathan strained against the enormous mechanism while Meera matched his rhythm on a second manual lever. And for one impossible minute, two living beings replaced the power that the most advanced station in the galaxy had just lost. But even as the flywheel gathered speed, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the chamber, and Nathan realized one of the governor's oldest support shafts had begun to fail, threatening to undo everything they had fought to save. Nathan heard the sharp crack before he saw where it came from. One of the massive support shafts had developed a long fracture that stretched almost halfway across the steel. The flywheel continued turning, but every rotation widened the gap a little more. Meera looked at the damaged shaft and quietly asked, "How long?" Nathan watched it complete another full revolution before answering. "Maybe 3 minutes. Maybe less." She swallowed hard. "Can we replace it?" He shook his head. Not without shutting everything down. The chamber fell silent except for the deep rhythm of ancient machinery fighting to stay alive. Above them, the gateway continued sending violent surges through the station. Dust drifted from the ceiling with every pulse. Nathan wiped sweat from his forehead and opened his toolbox again, searching through old hand tools until he pulled out a pair of heavy steel clamps. Meera stared at them. Those cannot possibly hold something this large. They do not have to hold it forever. Only long enough. Nathan nodded. Exactly. Together they climbed onto the maintenance platform surrounding the damaged shaft. Every step had to match the movement of the rotating mechanism. Too fast, and they would lose their balance. Too slow, and the crack would spread before they reached it. Nathan waited for the shaft to complete another turn, then locked the first clamp into place with practiced hands. Meera secured the second one just as another surge shook the chamber. Both clamps rattled violently, but they held. Nathan stepped back and watched the fracture. It stopped growing. For the moment, Meera finally smiled. "You did it." Nathan did not smile back. He was looking at the pressure gauge instead. Instead of dropping, the pressure had started climbing again. "No," he said quietly. "Something else is wrong." At the same moment, Commander Kaelor received another engineering report. The officer reading it sounded almost confused. "Commander, the mechanical governor has stabilized the support shaft." Kaelor folded his arms. "Then why is gateway stress still increasing?" Nobody answered. The computers had returned with partial functionality, but every new prediction contradicted the previous one. The station was no longer behaving according to any known model. Kaelor stared at the engineering schematic until something finally caught his attention. The old mechanical network ended at the governor, but one tiny branch continued beyond every modern map into an undocumented section beneath the station. "Magnify that area," he ordered. The display enlarged a forgotten section labeled only with an obsolete construction code from nearly 2 decades earlier. Kaelor frowned. Why was this never archived? No one on the bridge knew. Deep below, Nathan reached the same conclusion without seeing the map. He placed his hand against the conduit again and closed his eyes. The vibration had changed. It was no longer coming from the governor alone. There was another pulse underneath it, slower, deeper, and farther below the chamber. He opened his eyes and looked toward a rusted maintenance door hidden behind layers of old piping. The faded warning sign was almost unreadable, but one line still stood out beneath years of dust. Earth Engineering Division. Authorized personnel only. Meera followed his gaze. "What is behind that door?" Nathan remained quiet for several seconds. "I never knew this room existed." "Then how do you know it matters?" He tapped the old notebook resting inside his toolbox. "Because somebody wanted everyone to forget it." Before Meera could respond, the station shook harder than at any point since the crisis began. Every light flickered. The clamps groaned under the growing strain. Then, somewhere beyond the hidden door, an enormous machine slowly came to life, and the deep sound that rolled through the station was unlike anything either of them had ever heard before. Nathan pulled the rusted lever beside the hidden maintenance door, but nothing happened. He tried again with both hands until the old locking mechanism finally released with a heavy metallic click that echoed through the chamber. The door slowly drifted inward, releasing a wave of warm air that smelled faintly of machine oil instead of ozone. Meera lifted the inspection lamp, and both of them stepped inside. The room was smaller than either expected, but every wall was covered with mechanical control assemblies that looked decades older than anything else on the station. There were no holographic displays, no quantum processors, just heavy switches, pressure gauges, handwritten service labels, and rows of thick cables disappearing into the floor. Nathan ran his fingers across one of the faded metal plates. Earth Engineering Division. Emergency Manual Control. Meera looked around in disbelief. Why would anyone hide this? Nathan opened another cabinet and found an old maintenance binder sealed inside a weatherproof case. He flipped through the yellowed pages until one paragraph made him stop. "Listen to this," he said. "If autonomous systems become unstable during high-energy synchronization, operators must transfer load to manual harmonic regulation until automated control can safely resume." Meera frowned. That means the original engineers expected the artificial intelligence to fail. Nathan nodded slowly. Not fail. Reach a point where it could not adapt fast enough. At that moment his radio crackled again. Commander Kaelor's voice sounded very different than before. The confidence was still there, but now it carried something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. "Mr. Brooks, report." Nathan looked toward the old control panel. "Commander, your computers have been trying to correct the gateway by forcing perfect balance." "That is correct. That is the problem." Silence filled the channel. Nathan continued. "This station was never designed to stay perfectly balanced. The original builders expected constant tiny changes. The old mechanical network absorbs those changes naturally. Your software keeps fighting them instead." On the bridge, every officer turned toward Kaelor. The commander stared at the engineering schematics for several long seconds before quietly asking, "Can you prove it?" Nathan smiled to himself. "I already did. The station is still standing." No one answered. Even the bridge fell silent. Meera carefully studied the manual control console. 3 oversized levers connected directly to the hidden mechanical governor below. "What do these do?" Nathan followed the thick cables with his eyes until he understood. They let a human operator feel the gateway instead of calculating it. Feel it. Every vibration. Every shift. Every tiny correction. Meera looked confused. "That is impossible." Nathan rested one hand on the first control lever. Not if you have spent your whole career listening to machines instead of just reading numbers. The chamber suddenly shook again, but this time Nathan noticed something different. The vibration no longer felt random. It followed a repeating rhythm, almost like breathing. He slowly pushed the first lever forward by less than an inch. Instantly, the entire station seemed to exhale. Pressure readings across the old gauges dropped together for the first time since the crisis began. Up on the bridge, shocked officers watched gateway stability climb instead of fall. "Commander," one whispered, "the fluctuations are disappearing." Kaelor never looked away from the display. "Without the artificial intelligence." "Yes, Commander." Nathan made another tiny adjustment, then another, each movement guided by the subtle vibrations traveling through the steel beneath his hands rather than any computer model. Meera watched in amazement. "You are not reading the instruments." Nathan kept his eyes on the moving linkage. "No, then how do you know what to do?" He smiled without looking up. "Because after enough years, every machine tells you what it needs." Before either of them could celebrate, one final alarm suddenly appeared across every remaining operational display on the station. The gateway itself had stabilized, but an enormous energy surge was now racing back toward the station from the far side of the portal, and it would arrive in less than 60 seconds. Nathan looked at the countdown on the emergency panel. 58 seconds. The incoming energy surge was traveling through the gateway faster than any mechanical adjustment could compensate for. Meera stared at the rising numbers. Can the station survive it? Nathan studied the old gauges instead of the digital displays. The station can. What about the gateway? He took a slow breath. That depends on whether we stop trying to overpower it. He reached for the final control lever, the only one he had not touched. Its handle was worn smooth from hands that had used it decades earlier. A small engraved note sat beneath it. Manual resonance adjustment. Nathan smiled quietly. Whoever built this understood something everybody forgot. He pulled the lever halfway forward. The ancient machinery answered with a deep, steady hum that spread through every deck of the station. On the bridge, officers watched in disbelief as the gateway stopped resisting the incoming surge. Instead of forcing the energy away, the old mechanical governor absorbed the changing rhythm and gently redirected it through the stabilization network. Every warning light that had filled the command screens moments earlier disappeared one after another. "Gateway stability is increasing," one officer whispered. 93%. Another voice followed almost immediately. 96. Nobody spoke again until the final report appeared. 100%. Complete stabilization achieved. The station became quiet for the first time in hours. Commander Kaelor remained standing in front of the main display without saying a word. Every prediction his computers had made had been mathematically correct, yet every conclusion had been wrong because one variable had never existed inside the equations. Human judgment. A few minutes later, the emergency bulkheads reopened throughout the engineering decks. Kaelor walked into the hidden control room himself. Nathan was sitting on an old maintenance crate, wiping grease from his hands with a faded shop towel, while Meera carefully placed the weathered engineering binder back inside its protective case. Kaelor looked around the forgotten room before finally speaking. "Our records describe this place as obsolete." Nathan smiled. "Old does not mean useless." Kaelor nodded slowly. "No, it does not." For several long seconds, neither man said anything else. Then the commander asked the question that had been bothering him since the crisis began. "Why did you refuse to leave when every calculation said failure was certain?" Nathan leaned back against the wall and looked at the old machinery surrounding them. "Because I have spent my whole life fixing things." Kaelor waited. Nathan continued. "Sometimes people quit because they know they cannot win. Sometimes they quit because they are tired. Those are not the same thing. I was tired. I just was not finished." Meera lowered her eyes with a quiet smile. Weeks later, the Galactic Alliance updated its engineering training across every member world. The new manuals included a chapter that had never existed before. It was only one sentence long. Never remove experienced human engineers from a failing system simply because the numbers predict failure. Future officers would study the lesson for years without knowing the name of the man who inspired it. Nathan never asked for recognition. He finished his contract, packed the same dented toolbox he had carried through the station, and boarded a transport back to Earth. When he stepped through the arrival gate in Columbus, a little girl ran across the terminal and wrapped her arms around him. "Did you fix something cool?" Emma asked with a grin. Nathan laughed softly as he picked her up. "Yeah," he said. "It just took a little longer than I expected." Somewhere far beyond Earth, Commander Kaelor quietly stood before a classroom of young Alliance officers and ended his lecture with words none of them expected to hear. "Never mistake persistence for ignorance," he said. "Sometimes the person who refuses to walk away is the only reason everyone else gets to go home."